Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast, where we hear stories and have conversations about life in Christ, integrating our faith into every area of our life, and talk about ways that we as men can give life to others, at home, at work, and in the community. My name's Tom Henderson, the founder of RESGEN, and I'm so excited that you're tuning in for this episode. Today, I'm being joined by a friend of mine who was one of our speakers at this year's RESGEN Men's Summit back on February 3rd. Jeff Struecker served for 10 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment in positions ranging from private to platoon sergeant, and served another 10 years as a U.S. Army chaplain. Throughout his 23-year military career, Jeff has been awarded many commendations and decorations, including the Silver Star for Bravery in combat. In addition to all of that, he's the author of 6 books, the founder of the Unbeatable podcast, the lead pastor of Two Cities Church in Columbus, Georgia, and he's also a husband, father, and grandfather. On today's show, Jeff and I talk about what it was like seeing a battle that he fought in turned into the blockbuster hit movie Black Hawk Down, about his transition from Army Ranger to Army Chaplain, and what he is most proud of as he looks back on his military career. We also visit about the peace and assurance the Holy Spirit gave him while he was on the battlefield, and what we can do better to help and care for military veterans. Here's my conversation with my friend, Jeff Struecker. Jeff Struecker, man, it is good to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for joining me, brother.
Thanks. It is awesome to be with you.
Man, it was just 2 months ago when we were actually physically in the same spot when you came and were a part of the Men's Summit in February 3rd. And so I want to dig into all that because there's actually some things out of your message that I want us to talk a little bit more about. But to have you on as a guest is just, it's a thrill for me to be able to connect in this way. So as just a little intro, I'd love for you just to intro yourself. I gave a little introduction, of course, at the front end of the episode, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself to maybe some of the listeners that weren't at the Men's Summit, so they can kind of know a little bit about you, and then we're going to dive into a bunch of good stuff today.
Sure. Yeah. I'm a pastor, a father, husband, avid runner, but I also spent about 23 years in the U.S. Army, and a lot of people will recognize the name from the book or the movie Black Hawk Down.
Yeah. So I want to start with just that part of your story, because one of the things I loved about what you shared at the Men's Summit was how when you enlisted in the Army, it wasn't necessarily, you had aspirations for that your whole life. It was really more because a friend said, we should do this together, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And honestly, I think that probably happens more often than not. There are some people that knew way early in life, I want to go to the military. But for a lot of us, we just kind of stumble our way into it. And more than a few guys that I know were in the military because they were in a courtroom and a judge said, well, you can go to the military or go to jail. I just want to say I wasn't one of those guys. But for a lot of us, the military was not on the top of the radar. And then it ended up becoming something that I fell in love with.
Yeah. And was that something, Jeff, that when you decided okay, you were indeed going to pursue that, and you had the conversation with the recruiter, and they talked about the different areas of the military you could go in. And so you unpack that with people that, your family and loved ones. Did you feel any resistance from people in your life at all? Or were they all like, yeah, you should totally do that?
I'm laughing at you because, yes, I got lots and lots of resistance from my family. I didn't come from a military family, so they're not like hippies from the 60s, but they just didn't have a lot of military in the background. My grandfather wasn't able to serve in World War II because of a major car accident that almost cost his life. My father didn't serve in Vietnam because of his very poor eyesight, and I really didn't come from a military background. So when I told my family I was joining, they all thought I was crazy. My mother flipped out and did not like the fact that I was going to be in the military, and frankly, never really liked the fact until I retired 23 years later.
Wow. So, but now she's accepted it.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's because I'm retired from the Army now. And what choice do you have?
Right. Okay. So, so you go in and you have your experience in the Army, and what you did here at the Men's Summit is you really unpacked several of the combat missions that you were a part of. The one that's probably the most well known was portrayed in the movie Black Hawk Down and
Yeah.
Mogadishu, and so I got to ask you, and we're gonna get into just kind of your faith story and just how you really felt God's presence and the peace and assurance that He gave you on the battlefield. So I kind of want to unpack some of that with you too. But when you found out after you retired from the military, when you found out that they were going to make a movie based on a combat mission that you were involved in, and then you saw that portrayed on the big screen, what was that like for you?
Yeah. Well, I didn't want the movie made. I was in special operations almost my entire career. Out of 23 years in the Army, I think I served in special operations for about 16, almost 17 of it. And for the listener, that just means that everything that I did was classified, and that even my unit and my role was supposed to be undercover. So when when the book Black Hawk Down came out, they used my real name. That's not that big of a deal because you don't have a face with a name.
Okay.
When they started talking about making the movie, I just assumed, one, my character would never make it into the movie. It did. I assumed, two, that they would change my name. I was wrong there. And when I found out that there was an actor playing me in the movie, it was frankly, I was not happy about it. In fact, the movie actually came out while I was still serving in the Army.
Okay.
And I got a buddy who called me and said, Jeff, I'm having breakfast in the Ranger dining facility, and you'll never guess who's sitting across the table from me. And I said, I don't know, man. Give me a hint. And he said, it's the actor who's playing you in the movie. And I said, well, good. I hope that he does a great job. And he's like, no, you don't understand. He's wearing your uniform, and actually he looks a lot like you. And I just about lost it.
Wow.
For the listener, I almost lost it because that moment fundamentally changed what I could do in the military in the future. I could no longer be in a clandestine unit or be undercover anymore, because when I walked into a room, everybody recognized the guy from Black Hawk Down.
Wow. So did that shift just some things even in your mind, just like the whole identity? Because we could all say that our identity's in Christ and all of that, but that was a significant part of who you were.
Yeah. And I had to work really hard on this. So as a believer in the military, I came to faith in Christ before I joined the military. And as a believer in the military, everything about your career defines who you are. It's the haircut that you wear and the words, the language, literally the language that you use, and the clothes you wear and how you carry yourself. Every bit of it defines who you are. And I started early on in my career in the Army and regularly reminded myself, this is not who I am. This is what I do. In fact, the word Ranger, because I spent almost all of my career with the Army Rangers, the word Ranger became synonymous for my name. Like I lost the name and just became Ranger. And I had to remind myself in the mirror in the morning before I went to work, like Ranger is not who I am. It's just what I do. And one of these days, I'll no longer be an Army Ranger, and I'm totally okay with that. But the movie Black Hawk Down made it a lot more difficult to escape the military, attention that my name brings.
So that's an interesting comment, because, of course, you're asked to speak a lot about that season of your life.
Yeah.
But yet you have so much more to you than just Ranger Jeff Struecker, right? I mean, there's so much more of who you are, but yet you are even to come to the Men's Summit and talk about your experience, but be able to utilize that as a platform for the kingdom is such an amazing gift. But yet even that, you have to understand that I still got to go, and I have to tap into that Ranger side of me all the time.
Right. Yeah. I want to go back for just a second and just say to the audience, everybody struggles with this to some degree or the other. And it's something that I challenge people regularly, like put things into perspective. For Dr. Sally out there who's listening, yes, you're a doctor. You probably are a great doctor and you should take great pride in that. But don't forget, that's not who you are. It's a big part of your, what you do and your identity, but it's not your entire identity. Or for the lawyer or the teacher or the stay-at-home mom, whatever, be careful. Because when you lose that aspect of who you are, you can find yourself really, really struggling to accept what the world has, your place in the world after that. And I've watched many, many of my friends struggle after they took the uniform off. So I consider it an honor. I was a guy who didn't do interviews, didn't speak in public. I didn't want to do that stuff because my challenge was to do combat missions and to do it undercover. And then after the book and the movie Black Hawk Down came out, I started getting invited to speak at a lot of audiences. And a couple of buddies of mine who were in Somalia with me, we talked about this a little bit, and we kind of came to the consensus. One, there are a lot of good friends of mine that are buried in Arlington National Cemetery right now, and they can't tell their story, but I can tell their story for them. And I consider it a great privilege to be able to tell their story. But number two, I also want to take the attention off of Jeff and turn it to Jesus every time I'm talking. So I consider this as somebody else's story, and I'm just trying to be a good steward of the story that God has given me.
Yeah, yes. And in the few times I've been able to watch messages online, then of course have you here at the Men's Summit, you did that obviously extremely well. It was all about Jesus. And you just have this passion for Christ. I mean, you just have this passion to tell other people about the love of Jesus, the salvation, the unbelievable gift we can have through our relationship with Christ. And so you said that you came to Christ prior to entering the Army. How did that happen for you? How did you come into that life-saving relationship with Christ?
I love telling this part of the story. God did a miracle. Every salvation story is a miracle. It doesn't matter if you used to be an axe murderer or a prostitute. Every salvation story is equally a miracle because every soul is equally dead before it's made alive in Christ. But in my case, I was about as far from Jesus as a human being can possibly get. And I mean this language quite literally. Because I didn't grow up in a Christian home, I didn't have anyone around me that was talking to me about faith. I grew up in a home that were practically speaking atheists. And I had lots and lots of questions about faith, but I couldn't get the answers because no one in my world knew the answers to questions about faith. And I struggled for years as a kid with questions about faith and the afterlife and all of that. And I couldn't get the answers because no one around me knew them, which is why I call myself like as far from Jesus as you can get, because nobody in my world can connect me to him. And then God loved me enough that we moved to a apartment complex outside in a suburb outside of Nashville, Tennessee. And after living there for a few weeks, he sent my next door neighbors, a young married couple, just a few years older than me. I'm 13 years old and a freshman in high school. And he sent my next door neighbors to knock on the door and come talk to me. And they explained Jesus and sin and what it took to be a Christian to me that night. First time in my life anybody's ever really explained it to me.
Wow.
And that night, man, all of the pieces fell into place. It wasn't while they were talking to me at my table. It was later on that night when I was laying in bed that I just started rehashing the conversation, and every bit of it made sense. And I got out of bed and I prayed, and Jesus radically changed me. I tell people, he reached down and grabbed this kid and pulled me out of my sin. And I mean, it was a massive change. So when I joined the Army, 18, still in high school, I already knew beyond a shadow of a doubt where my eternity would be spent. And that puts a lot of things into perspective when you're on a battlefield and you're facing enemy fire and you know where you're going to go after you die. I mean, makes life a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah. So after that interaction with that young couple, I want to go back to them in a minute. But so your family, obviously, I'm sure they became very aware of this change that took
Yeah.
place within you, because I'm sure you didn't just keep that to yourself. Maybe your behaviors changed, maybe some of the way you talk to them, who knows? But what was their response to this radical change
Yeah.
that Jesus accomplished in your life?
It was a bit odd because after that, nobody really discipled me, and I'm using the word disciple biblically speaking here. So we moved around a couple more times before finishing high school. I left Nashville not long after meeting this couple, and I just got up on a Sunday morning and I walked to church because nobody in my family was going to church. And I mean, I just walked to the closest church. I remember I'd wake my mom up and I would ask her for a dollar bill. And she would look at me like, what are you going to do with the dollar? You're going to go buy some candy with it? And I said, no, I need money to put in an offering plate because the old people at church look bad at me if I don't put money in the offering plate. Would you give me a dollar to put in the offering plate? And I just got up and walked to church, whatever was close by, wherever I was living. And for me, I just bounced around the Christian church, scene in America, really until I was about 21, 22 years old in the United States Army and in the duty station that I finally got plugged in and finally started to grow.
Man, just even the way that you took the initiative and you were intentional about saying, like, listen, there's a church there. I'm going to walk there. I need a dollar. So, just even that, with maturity beyond your years and just like you talk about the radical changes, which I think is just such an amazing thing. But I want to go back to that couple because that is such an inspiration, I think, really, or it should be for all of us, because you think about just, their following through with what had to have been a prompting by the Holy Spirit to come and to talk to this teenage kid, who, a lot of people avoid teenage kids because they're,
Of course.
because they're
and I was not the best teenage kid to hang around with at 13 years old, definitely.
Exactly. So, but yet they took it upon themselves to do that. And I think about the story of like just how Ananias was such a key role for Saul, and how they were like Ananias to you. And like, it's like you moved to Nashville the Lord moved you to Nashville on purpose because he wanted you to meet this couple that could help introduce you to this Jesus Christ of Nazareth that could change your life. Yeah. And then because, God knows just everything and just how he was going to use you in powerful ways as a teenager in the Army and now continue today. Tell me you've seen that couple again.
No, I haven't. And I have my whole life tried to track this couple down. Now, the tragedy is that I don't know their last name. We lived directly across the hall from one another in an apartment complex. I still remember where we lived, but I only remember his first name. And they were a young married couple. Probably 21, 22 years old.
Yeah.
When they talked to me. But I want the listeners to know that when they came over to talk to me, they came over to my apartment and they were acting really weird from the time that they walked in the door. I've only known them for a few weeks, but I remember I thought that they were mad at me that I did something wrong. And I was waiting for them to tell me that they were mad at me or I had, I did something wrong to offend them. And then they sat down and I'm thinking about it now as a grown man, replaying the conversation, but I will never forget how nervous they were. Every time they started talking, it was pretty obvious to me at 13, and I've never had somebody share their faith with me before. It was obvious to me they were nervous. And I've since come to the conclusion, I think I'm the first person they've ever talked to about Jesus in their life. And when they were done, they just kind of left it there in my lap and ran back across the hall to their apartment. And I think I want your listeners to know, you cannot possibly mess this up. If this couple could be that nervous and stumbling all over themselves, but every word made sense to me and it all fell into place, after they left, there's no way you can mess this up. So just being faithful to tell somebody and doing it from a sincere heart, man, God will use that. And in many times, God will change somebody's life. It might not happen right in front of you, might be weeks or months or even years later. But man, I am convinced there's no way you can mess up sharing your faith.
Yeah, and we do. We feel like, I think it's just that it's the natural feeling that we get of saying, well, what if I say something wrong?
Yeah,
What if I mislead somebody? What if I'm not complete in my my sentence structure? Sounds like they probably had some of all of that.
I'm sure. And I remember what Jesus said, like when you're on those moments where you're on trial or you're opening your heart and your faith up to other people, the Holy Spirit takes over after that. He knows what they need to hear. And sometimes words will come out of your mouth. You don't even know where that came from, but that's exactly what they needed to hear right now.
Right.
And if I could, I would find that couple, go to their door and say, you have no idea, because I moved just a few weeks later. You have no idea the difference you made. But I'll tell you, when I get to heaven, the very first people I'm going to go look up are those two and say thank you, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you.
Oh my gracious. That's going to be like the best conversation ever.
Yeah.
I mean, there's going to be a lot of great conversations in heaven, but that's going to be another good one for sure. So,
yeah.
Okay. So now I want to talk about just, okay, so you have this faith, you come in and you said that it was when you were about 22 years old and you're fully in the Army now. And so that's where you really began kind of understand like the discipleship process, you would say, as far as like where it was like, I'm actually going through and having people invest in me in that way.
Yeah.
Did I hear that correctly?
Right. Yeah. And what happened to me is I started to get plugged into one church over a long term instead of bouncing from church to church. I don't think that there's a perfect discipleship process. I'm putting air quotes around that.
Yeah.
I think any discipleship process is better than no discipleship process. And unfortunately, a lot of churches have none. But what I started to learn, what I started to hear from people in this church is, Jeff, God didn't put you on earth just to kick in doors and kill bad guys. Yeah, he's made you a soldier. Maybe you're really, really good at it. And now I'm talking to the attorney, to the teacher, to the doctor, to the stay-at-home mom again. God didn't put you on the earth for that reason only. He put you on the earth to make an eternal impact in people's lives. We call that discipleship. And you can easily, very naturally do it in the world that you live in, at the hospital, in a courtroom, in the home with your children, or in a classroom. That's your real reason for existing. And it was an epiphany for me. Like, God didn't put me on earth to be an Army Ranger. He made me an Army Ranger so that I could be a disciple maker. And that's what I needed to hear at 21, 22 years old. That fundamentally changed the way that I looked at the future.
Right. And even though the views started to shift a little bit, that doesn't mean that everything came easy. That didn't mean that there weren't times where life, because a lot of times we can feel it, well, God's supposed to make my life perfect now, which again, we know John 16:33 says, in this world you will have trouble, but we can take heart because he has overcome the world.
Right.
But there was something that you stated. There's a couple statements in your message. And, during the day, I'm so busy in orchestrating everything and all that, I don't get to always just fully engage in the message, but I've since gone back and listened to every single message, and yours included. And there was a couple of quotes that I just pulled out from your message that kind of stood out to me. And it was during a section where you were talking about being in the Humvee, and there was just bullets flying everywhere, and just it was chaotic, and you felt like you needed to get your unit under control, but yet in order for you to do that, you first needed to get yourself under control, because there's no way that you could, expand that to your unit without being in control of yourself. And so I'm wondering, Jeff, what did that look like? Are there certain scriptures that were important to you in those moments where it was chaotic, that were a part of just understanding that God was still with you and all of that?
Yeah. The answer to your question is yes, definitely. A lot of what how I reacted to the enemy fight in Somalia, in Black Hawk Down, was because of the military training that I've been through. But I would be wrong if I didn't say, but another significant part of it is because of my faith. And my faith fundamentally influenced the way that I fight. I still have to tell people about that, even people in the U.S. military, because they don't share my faith. They kind of don't have a faith, so to speak, and they scratch their heads and say, I don't understand how that works. And I say, you wouldn't understand unless you shared the power of the faith that I have. But this quote that I love to use, it's true of all leadership situations, right? Like when there's a leadership crisis, and I use the analogy, when the building is on fire, and this is a metaphor, right? Like whenever whatever walk of life you're in, when the building is on fire and you're a leader, everyone is looking to you. And what they want to know is, are you able to keep yourself under control? The perfect example of this is the airline flight attendants when there's turbulence, right? Everybody on the plane looks at the flight attendants. And if they look like, it's off, no big deal, then most people on the plane are like, oh, this is terrible, but at least it's not that big of a deal to them. So maybe it shouldn't be that big of a deal to me. If the flight attendants are freaking out and jumping underneath the seats, everybody on the airplane is going to freak out.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what happened to me in Somalia. But that doesn't account for the whole thing. I got up every morning. I've been doing this for more than 30 years, and I spent time in the scriptures. I do it personally. It's the very first thing that I do. I don't miss a day, period, because this is my time with Jesus, and I don't care what else is happening around me. I'm going to spend 5 minutes or 55 minutes or whatever I have with Jesus. And when I was in Somalia, I was getting up, spending a few moments in the scriptures. And just a few weeks before the big fight, I read the story all over again of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I started reflecting. In the middle of that fight, 100% certain that I'm going to die, I started reflecting on Jesus's prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the prayer basically went, Father, I don't want to do this. Basically, that's what he's saying. If there's any way possible, let this cup pass from me. I'm bringing people in and out of the city streets. I'm going in and out of the city streets. People are dying all around me. And I know the next time in, I'm not going to make it out. And I start to pray, God, if there's any way possible, let this pass from me. I don't want to do this. And then, Tom, there was a moment, and I'll never forget it. I'm washing blood out of the back of my Humvee with my bare hands, don't even have gloves on. And I remember Jesus's response to God next. Not my will, but your will be done. And this is the moment that I started realizing the Son of God knew exactly what was going to happen to him before he went on trial and before he went to the cross. He knew about the pain ahead of time, and he said, I am willing to do this. And he did that for me and for you and for your listeners. And at that moment, I experienced what I can only describe as like supernatural peace. I don't even know the right language to use. The Bible would refer to it as the peace that passes all understanding. But I am 100% sure I'm going to die and at total peace with it. And no fear whatsoever about death, because I know it's coming. It's going to happen in the next 30 minutes, and I know where I'm going to spend eternity. So what do I have to worry about? And it was the prayer that Jesus prayed in the garden, and especially his commitment to the Father, like, whatever I have to do tonight, whatever it is, I'm willing to do it. And that's what gave me the courage, really, there's no other word to say, to go on, get back on the vehicles and go back in the city again and again.
Wow. Yeah, which, I mean, goes so well into the other statement that I just feel like it was, and when you said this, because I was in the room when you said this statement, I felt like this incredible, like, people just, like it just, I could feel that. I didn't hear it audibly, but I heard it like in all their spirits, right? But it was a statement of, I either go home to my family in Georgia, or I go home to my Father in heaven. No matter what happens next, I cannot lose because of what Jesus has done for me. And I mean, I don't think there's a more powerful statement that any of us could make.
Well, Tom, I love to remind Christians, like, I'm a simple guy and there's nothing special about my faith. And the only reason I have this relationship with God is because Jesus loved me enough to come clean me up and change me. And what I want audiences to hear, and if that statement that you just mentioned hit home with people, what I want audiences to hear is there is absolutely nothing special about Jeff's faith. What I am describing is true for every Christian all over the planet for all time. The very worst thing that can happen to you, all of the martyrs who have been willing to give their life up, is because the very worst thing that somebody can do to me here on planet Earth is actually the best thing that can happen to me, eternally speaking. So maybe I go home to my family in Georgia. Maybe I go home to my Father in heaven. It really doesn't matter, because of my eternity being rock solid in Jesus Christ. And not just me, every Christian listening to this podcast.
Well, the thing is that, oftentimes we think about eternity with Jesus just after we leave this earth. But the thing is that when we become a Christian, when we become a believer, our eternity with Jesus begins right then. It starts immediately. And so
that's right.
You knew the comfort and the peace and the assurance that came from knowing that when you were in that battle, it was chaotic. But Jesus is right there with you. And he is interceding for you, and he is giving you this peace that surpasses all understanding. And I think about your statement of saying that's what gives you the courage. And the entire theme of the summit this year was all about courage, and the way the Holy Spirit wove all those messages together,
it was awesome.
Was just crazy. But you and I both talked about the freedom that comes from our surrender. But it takes tremendous courage to surrender, especially as men, because we like to be in control. But that surrender is what, like you just spoke of, is what gave you this peace and gave you this joy, even amongst the most difficult, crazy, like, oh my gosh, I'm probably going to die situation.
I love your language, Tom. For all of the control freaks out there, I want to remind you, control is an illusion. You really don't have the control that you think you do. Don't believe me? Can you make the sun come up tomorrow? Can you make it rain? None of us have the control that we'd like to think we have. But secondly, the insatiable desire to control your circumstances itself becomes a form of slavery. Like real freedom is saying, I don't have any idea what's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe it's going to rain. Maybe the sun doesn't come up. But I do know this, the God of the universe, the one that controls the rain and the sun, also has me in the palm of his hand. And I got nothing to worry about if he's got me in the palm of his hand.
Yeah, so I think that's such an interesting, thing to talk about, but that it's also a truth that I think we just have to grab a hold of and then live by every single day, because I think that we live in a world, right, that is constantly trying to get us to fear something.
Right.
And it bothers me so much, Jeff. And when we have believers that we just give into that fear. And I'm like, what are we fearful of? And I get it. I get it that fear is a real thing, but man, we are given the enemy footholds in our life when we just are continually living by fear.
Right. I realize that my story is a bit extreme because I'm on a battlefield surrounded by enemy 100-1. And I don't control if I live or die. I literally have no control over that. I do my job. Maybe I survive. Maybe the guys around me survive. Maybe they don't. I don't know. And I realize that's a little bit extreme, but the truth is that none of us can control how tomorrow are going to turn out. So if you really want to have victory over fear, the answer is found in the scriptures. It's actually found in Psalm 23. I love to quote David, who was perhaps the greatest warrior recorded in scriptures, second only to Jesus. And I'm referring to Jesus, the warrior, in Revelation 19. But David says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and this is, I should have real fear about what could happen around me in this valley, even though I walk through that valley. And notice he's walking, not running. I'm in no hurry, because even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear, because you are with me. Not because I'm the baddest man in the valley, not because of how great of a warrior I am, not because of all of the things in my life that I've controlled so that bad stuff can't happen to me. I won't fear because you're with me. And if you're with me, what do I got to worry about?
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. So let me ask you this, because you went from being, on the battlefield like literally, to then transitioning into becoming an Army chaplain.
Yeah.
Which and fulfilling a different role, really engaging now into more of a full-time ministry. Again,
Right.
we're all in full-time ministry if we're walking with Jesus. Okay, to be clear.
Absolutely.
Okay, but now your focus has gone from being on the battlefield and then now to being a chaplain, where you are now ministering to these guys and saying, "Listen, I know everything that you're feeling. I know what you're going into, all of that kind of thing." I want to first talk about just the transition in roles for you.
Yeah.
Was that a difficult transition for you to kind of change hats, so to speak?
Oh man, it was brutal. Um, I kind of had an idea what I thought it would be like to be an Army chaplain because by this point, I had spent almost 13 years as an enlisted guy in the Army. I went to school, got the education. I ended up having a bit of a break from the military and came back in as a chaplain. But I came back in before the attacks on September 11th. So I'm a chaplain serving in the
Mm.
82nd Airborne Division when the Twin Towers fall. And I am really, really competent. I know how to handle myself on the battlefield against the enemy. Give me a rifle, I know exactly what to do. And when I went to combat the first time as a chaplain, I was really struggling. It was a tremendous transition for me. And I had to regularly remind myself, Jeff, your job on the battlefield is not the enemy. Now, for a guy with my combat experience, it's almost impossible not to think about the enemy when I'm on a battlefield.
Mm.
But I had to regularly remind myself, you are not here for the enemy, Jeff. You are here to minister to the souls of America's military.
Mm.
And if you spend your time focused on the enemy, you're not going to be effective reaching the U.S. military. If you want to reach the U.S. military, you're going to have to forget about the enemy. And that was not easy to do.
Wow.
So 9 combat deployments to Afghanistan and 5 to Iraq as a chaplain. And every one of them were really hard because I had to force myself to think about my men and women, the men and women of my unit, not the enemy.
What did you learn about yourself during that time?
Yeah, I had a lot of growing up to do. I learned just how precious my family was to me. I knew I loved my wife, I loved their children, but my first deployment to Afghanistan, I had 5 children, and this was really, really tough.
Mm.
And I learned I don't have an excuse. I have to figure out how to be a good dad from 20,000 miles away. Um, and I also learned, man, I have some limitations and I need good people around me that can fill those gaps that I have. And I need to be around some good people where I can step in and fill the gaps. All of us need a couple of brothers and sisters around us that are going to keep us strong and pick us up when we're weak.
Mm-hmm. As you were transitioned in that way in yourself, and you learned that about yourself, what do you think that God taught you as you look back on that? What did God teach you about himself during that time?
Yeah, well, ultimately, and he showed this to me over and over and over again. He showed me, Jeff, I will be faithful. Now, the way that my plans, my desires, and what I want God to do and what he actually does, because his plans, his desires for me, those two things do not always line. I'll be honest, they don't often line up. But there has never been a time that God has not been faithful to me. And sometimes in the most challenging circumstances, and I'm talking about just paying the bills or facing a health problem or something in the family, I have to go back and remind me, the God that was with me in the streets of Somalia, the God that was with me on the side of a mountain in Afghanistan, he will be with me in this one too. And I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I know that he will be faithful.
Mm, yeah. I think that's a good word just for, again, for listeners today to just, because there's any number of battles and difficulties
Sure.
and challenges that people are walking through right now. And so I believe there's at least 1 or 2 people out there that just need to hear that listen,
Absolutely.
God is faithful because, I mean, that is a definition of, he is love. He is faithful. Right. And wherever you're dealing with difficult times and challenges and things right now, whatever it is in your family, in your job, God will be faithful in some way. And,
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. That doesn't mean that it's always going to feel good. But in God's faithfulness, he will make whatever it is good in his plan and in his purposes. So, so let me ask you this, and we're coming up to the time where we'll need to end our conversation, but as you look back on your military career, you said almost 23 years of military career. I mean, you obviously received a number of awards, commendations, again, not being from a military family. My grandfather served and had a lot of different awards, but I couldn't even name them. I'm a city kid from Sioux Falls. And so, but you have a lot of things that were part of your military career to be proud of. But as you look back on your military career, what are you the most proud of, Jeff?
Oh, man. Thank you for this question. I retired in 2011. And I had a bunch of very close friends that were in the audience, people that I'd served with in the military. And I said, I've had a chance to go around the world, see some incredible things, do some amazing things. And honestly, one of the greatest privileges that I had in the military is the people that I've had a chance to work with. I will cherish those people for the rest of my life because of how incredible the men and women of the U.S. military are. I said, look, there's stuff on my uniform, all kinds of awards on my uniform, lots of decorations, lots of badges that recognize what I've done, but I don't take pride in any of it. And I meant this. I joined the Army with all of my fingers and all of my toes, and I left the Army with all of my fingers and all of my toes. And not all of my buddies can say that. But I said, the one thing that I am most proud of is that I married my high school sweetheart. We had 5 children together. I am still married to my high school sweetheart. We have a great relationship with our 5 children. And everything else that I've seen, all that I've done, all of the awards and badges, none of it means anything to me compared to my relationship with my wife and our 5 children. And that's something very few people in the military can say. And it's unfortunate, it's tragic because they have sacrificed their families for the sake of a career. So when I retired, I said, all of that stuff that I've done, it was awesome. It was a privilege. But the thing that I take pride in is my marriage and our children.
Mm-hmm. Which is a perfect segue into my final question for you, Jeff, and then to give you the chance to kind of just talk about how people can connect with you and have a final word for us. But you mentioned earlier in the podcast, you just mentioned it again, that it's sometimes can be a challenge in transitioning out of the military. And we hear about just the challenges that veterans, go through when they are no longer a part of whatever of the branch of the armed forces that they were a part of. We hear about suicide rates within former military professionals, and you just spoke about just even the impact that has on their relationships. So it makes me just wonder, what can we do? I mean, as believer or not, but I mean, especially as believers, how can we better care for veterans in our communities and in our cities and people coming off the battlefield and trying to get back into normal civilian life?
Right.
Are there a couple things? What can we do?
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked it. Divorce is rampant, suicide, drug addiction, PTSD, it's rampant in the military. And it's frankly because of war, what war does to the human soul. And I think the human soul is supposed to be impacted by war. So one, go to bed tonight thanking God that there is a professional military force that volunteered to serve you so that you didn't have to go overseas and serve, and volunteered. It's an entirely volunteer military, and volunteered to do whatever the country needs them to do so that we can be a free society and frankly, a beacon for the rest of the world. But the second thing that everyone can do, should do really, is to thank a veteran and their families. And I mean this quite literally. I don't know one guy or gal who joined the military because of the money. You will not get rich in the military. In fact, far from it. For a good bit of the time that I was in the military, I lived below the poverty line while I was on active duty. But every guy or gal that I know who's in uniform, they're serving because they love our way of life and they want to protect or preserve it. And a simple thank you from a total stranger means the world. It really does. But not just the guy or gal in uniform. They're easy to spot at the airport. Would you go up and thank the military family too? Because that job is thankless. And quite honestly, most people in America have no idea the sacrifices that the military family goes through. And all of them do it just to know that their country appreciates it. Really, just a simple thank you means the world.
Yeah, that's makes me think of a quote by, and I don't know if he was the first one to ever say it, but Doug Fields, longtime youth ministry guru, that says affirmation is food for the soul, and we live in a world that is starving. And what you just talked about is a group of people that are hungry for that affirmation and that encouragement in their life. And one of the things I'm glad you said that, because with flying a lot and traveling and all of that, I often see people in uniform.
You'll see them at the airport.
And I will always say, hey, just thank you so much for your service. And I'm always hopeful that it doesn't come off as trite, and it doesn't come off as something that seems disingenuous, because it's not. So I'm glad to know that is meaningful. Yeah. But I think
it meant the world to me. I still do it when I'm at the airport. I'm in civilian clothes, and theoretically, people don't even recognize me. And I'll walk up to somebody in uniform and just look them in the eyes and say, man, thank you for being willing to serve.
Yeah. So I think that's a good reminder. But then also those veterans, because we've all been at gatherings. We just had a big Sioux Falls prayer breakfast here on Good Friday. It happens every year. And at the front end of it, they have, if you served and you're a military veteran, why don't you stand up and applaud? And so it's nice to know that is meaningful to them, and that it's not just something that seems like, oh, they're just doing this at the beginning, but for us to really be grateful and thankful for their service, I think is something that I think it's a great reminder for all of us.
For almost every guy or gal I know in uniform or veteran, that simple recognition means the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jeff, I'm grateful for our friendship. I'm grateful that we got to do ministry together this past February, and then to be able to reconvene and have this follow-up conversation today. And I don't know if you know this, but I know you know this, but we initially got connected because of a mutual friend named Matt Teason, who was out at Fort Benning, and I had heard about you, and I told Matt, hey, I want you to go check this guy out. I want you to go to his church, and I want you to listen to him preach. And then he ended up having lunch a couple different times, and he had to say, I got to tell you why I even never came to your church. It was because of my buddy Tom in Sioux Falls that wanted me to come and listen to you preach, because he does this men's thing. And so I'm so grateful that you were, that you connected with my buddy Matt, and that you were open to coming and being a part of ministry here and ministering to thousands of men, this past year. So from my heart to yours, just thank you, number one, for your service to our country, and thank you for your service to the Lord while you were serving in that capacity, and then your continued service to Him now in all the different things you're doing.
Well, thanks for sending Matt. That guy is amazing, and I've thoroughly enjoyed getting a chance to know him while he was with us.
Yeah, for sure. And we even got him to fly back in so that he could.
That was awesome.
So that he could see you. Well, I'd love for you just to let people know how they can maybe connect with you a little bit more. Go ahead and talk about your podcast as well, and then I'll have you give what we call a final word, which is just 60 to 90 seconds of whatever the Lord lays on your heart just to share with us.
If you want to know more about me, you can find me on my website or social media. Just go to jeffstruecker.com, and that name is spelled Struecker. I do have a podcast and lots of other stuff out there, but all of that's in one spot at jeffstruecker.com. And I think what I'd like to say to the listeners is there is genuinely nothing special about my faith. All of us have this supernatural, equally miraculous experience where Jesus loved us enough that He was willing to change us. And because of that, He's got you in the palm of His hand. And if you really believe He's got you in the palm of His hand, then you've got nothing to worry about when life gets scary. So just remind yourself of that when situations start to get really hairy around you.
Yeah. That's so good. Well, Jeff, again, thank you for everything. Really appreciate you. God bless you as you continue to minister, not just in Georgia where you live and where you pastor, but all over as you share the gospel to all corners of the world, wherever the Lord takes you. And we'll look forward to connecting again soon.
Thanks, Tom. It's been great being with you.
All right. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jeff Struecker today. As always, if you found this episode helpful, I encourage you to share it with others that may find it helpful as well. If you'd like to connect more with Jeff, you can do so at jeffstruecker.com. And don't forget to also check out his podcast, the Unbeatable Podcast, on your favorite pod platforms. Well, that's all for today, friends. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you next time for another episode of the RESGEN Giving Life Podcast. Until then, continue being men whose life in Christ gives life to others. We'll see you soon.